It started like most things with the HOA do, quiet, unannounced, and wrapped in red tape that smells of superiority. I came home late one evening, dust from the construction site still clinging to my boots, jacket slung over one shoulder, and there it was slapped right onto my front door like a passive-aggressive invitation to war. A paper, laminated and curling at the corners, stamped with a bright red warning and a fine. Violation: excess vehicles. Immediate correction required. Fine: $500. That was the first time I heard about the rule. Not from a neighbor. Not from a friendly reminder. Just a demand. Just a fee. At first, I didn't take it seriously. I figured it was another mistake. I had received things like this before: clerical errors, letters meant for someone else, mail that had no business on my porch. But this time was different. The tone was accusatory. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a sentence. And worse than that, it carried the full, arrogant weight of a committee of people who never once knocked on my door or looked me in the eye. The cars they were talking about weren't junkers. They weren't leaking oil or blocking sidewalks. One was my black work truck, beat up, sure, but reliable. Another was my late father's old Lincoln, which I had been restoring piece by piece every weekend. The third, a small silver sedan I let my niece use when she came to stay for school. None of them were parked illegally. None of them broke any city code. But the HOA didn't care about legality. They cared about appearance. They cared about power. I took the notice inside and sat with it under the kitchen light. It was printed on thick paper, unnecessarily professional, as if that made it more legitimate. They had included photos, 3 grainy, zoomed-in images of my driveway, taken from what I assume was the opposite sidewalk. No names were signed. No contact number was given. Just an address to send the payment to. That was their version of communication, a fine and a faceless threat. I looked outside. The street was dark, quiet, no one around. But somehow I could feel eyes on me. I've lived long enough to recognize when judgment fills a neighborhood like fog, the kind that sneaks in through windows and clings to you even when you're alone. That week, I noticed the stairs more often, cars slowing down just a bit as they passed my house. Neighbors who used to wave, suddenly too busy looking at their phones. One woman across the street hurried her kids inside when she saw me working on the Lincoln like my tools were weapons. What none of them realized, what the HOA never stopped to consider, was that I wasn't just another homeowner trying to scrape by in a neighborhood built on appearances. I didn't move here last year. I didn't rent this place from some faceless landlord. This street was more than a place I lived. It was mine, but I hadn't revealed that part yet. I never needed to. I'd stayed quiet for a reason. Watched and waited. Let the HOA play their little game of control. Let them parade their clipboards and bylaws and secret meetings. But when they taped that notice to my door, when they tried to shame me for having too many cars, for damaging the neighborhood aesthetic, they crossed into territory they didn't understand. They assumed I was beneath them, that I didn't read fine print, that I'd pay the fine, move the car, bow my head, and disappear. They assumed wrong, because that piece of paper, that one act of arrogance, was the beginning of something they couldn't take back. The crack in the dam. The first drop before the flood. And once the flood comes, it doesn't ask who's in charge. It just takes everything in its path. The days that followed were strangely quiet, but it was the kind of silence that hums with tension. The kind that doesn't mean peace, it means something's coming. I noticed small things first. A folded notice on my windshield, left in the early hours before the sun touched the pavement. Another letter slipped under my door, and signed, stern in tone, listing a set of escalating fines for non-compliance. They no longer just cared about the number of vehicles. Now it was the angle they were parked at. One tire brushing against a blade of grass, they said, constituted lawn damage. Another was parked too close to the curb, though there were no markings, no signs, nothing but the imaginary rulebook they pulled from the air when it suited them. Then came the threat of towing. Not a suggestion, not a warning. A firm declaration that unauthorized vehicles will be subject to immediate removal at the owner's expense. The next HOA meeting, they said, would determine the timeline. I wasn't invited to that meeting, of course. Residents were always welcome, but only in the way museums welcome children, seen, not heard, and certainly not respected. Decisions had already been made long before they sat in their little rented conference room with their plastic water bottles and their printed agendas. The president of the HOA was a man named Dennis Harwood. I had met him once in passing. The kind of man who wore sunglasses in the shade and a Bluetooth headset like it was part of his body. He lived 3 houses down, in a home he'd mortgaged within an inch of its life, but you'd think he owned the whole county by the way he walked. He fancied himself a community leader, someone who brought order to the block. In reality, he was just the loudest man in a room full of silence. A bully in a polo shirt. Dennis was the one behind the escalation. I could feel it. His signature wasn't on the notices, but the tone was unmistakable. He was pushing to make an example out of me, to show the neighborhood that the HOA wasn't to be challenged, that even something as harmless as a few cars in a driveway could be twisted into a rebellion worth crushing. It wasn't about rules. It was about dominance, control. I heard whispers from neighbors. One woman stopped me near the mailboxes, eyes darting, voice low. She said they'd talked about my place in the last meeting, that Dennis had pushed for a full vote to revoke my community privileges. I asked her what that even meant. She didn't know, just that it involved limited access to shared areas, restrictions on guests, and the possibility of forced mediation. They were inventing punishments now, stretching bylaws like old leather until they snapped. Some of the board members weren't comfortable with it, she told me. But Dennis had sway. He played golf with the treasurer, had dinner with the vice president's family. He had surrounded himself with nodding heads and folded arms. And while the rest of the neighborhood stayed quiet, pretending neutrality, Dennis pressed forward, thinking this would be a clean and easy win. A reminder of who held the power on this street. I noticed a security patrol drive by more often. A hired third-party firm with flashing amber lights and a clipboard. One night around 2 a.m., I watched as the guard slowed in front of my house and took a photo of my vehicles. Not the license plates, the vehicles themselves, like they were evidence in some case being built behind closed doors, like they were preparing for something more serious. The escalation was deliberate, strategic. They weren't just trying to find me. They were trying to break me, hoping I'd get tired, that I'd sell, that I'd leave. They didn't know what I knew. They didn't know how deeply my name was rooted in the soil of this street. They thought they were dealing with just another homeowner, another easy target. They didn't realize the chessboard they were playing on didn't belong to them. It wasn't long before the whispers grew into something sharper. I could feel it in the way people looked at me, like I had become the neighborhood's newest headline. Not a person, but a story passed between porches and backyard fences. The guy with too many cars. The troublemaker. The one disrupting the peace. I noticed how quickly eyes turned away when I walked by, how waves got shorter, how doorways seemed to close just a bit faster when I returned home. There was no confrontation, no yelling, no real conversation, just a slow withdrawal, like the neighborhood was holding its breath and waiting for me to go away. The gossip wasn't always loud, but it was constant. I'd catch pieces of it in the wind. Can you believe he parks like that? He's probably running a business out of the garage. That can't be legal. One afternoon, I was standing in my yard trimming the hedges when a boy riding past on his bike said, without looking, "My dad says you're why the HOA has to be strict." He didn't say it with malice. He said it like he was repeating a lesson he'd memorized. A piece of doctrine passed down at the dinner table. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that none of this had anything to do with the cars. The cars were just the excuse. The vehicle, so to speak, for something much deeper. The neighborhood had become a place where uniformity was king, where every mailbox matched, every lawn was trimmed to a precise inch, and every deviation was treated like rot spreading through clean wood. It wasn't about safety. It was about control through conformity. I remembered when I first started investing in this area. The houses were older then, worn but strong. Families moved in and out, kids played in the streets, and neighbors borrowed sugar and lawnmowers without fear or formality. But things changed when the HOA took root. Slowly at first, just a few rules here and there, reminders to keep trash bins hidden or paint your shutters neutral colors. But over time, the rules thickened, hardened, until they weren't guidelines anymore. They were gospel. Some of the very same people now, judging me, had moved into houses I helped renovate. Homes I'd once walked through with electricians, plumbers, and roofers to bring back to life. They didn't know. Or maybe they'd forgotten. Maybe it was easier for them to pretend I was just some outsider disturbing the harmony they bought into. It was easier to believe I was a problem than to question the system that labeled me one. There was one morning that stood out. I was taking out the trash when I saw Mr. Landry from 2 doors down, retired, always dressed like he was heading to church. He used to talk to me about weather and football. That day, he just stood still, watching me. And when I nodded, he looked away without acknowledgement, like I'd been erased from the ledger of respectable residents. At the same time, I noticed people had started taking more photos. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, someone checking their phone or adjusting a camera for a house project. But the angles were always aimed in my direction, subtle, careful, and then quickly tucked away when I made eye contact. Some even crossed the street to avoid passing too close to my driveway, as if my cars might infect them. It wasn't fear, it was disdain. The gossip fed the HOA's fire. Every sideways glance, every shared rumor gave Dennis and his board more fuel to justify their crusade. The community feels unsafe. Multiple residents have expressed concerns. That's what the letters began to say. Vague complaints dressed up in legalese. I requested copies of the complaints. None had names, none had dates, just accusations floating in a sea of assumption. But I stayed quiet. I let them watch. Let them talk. Let them build their narrative of who I was and why I didn't belong. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew that gossip is a fragile weapon. It makes people bold when they think the target is powerless. But the moment truth steps into the room, it shatters. And I was getting ready to bring that truth to the table. The decision to pull the records wasn't emotional. It wasn't about revenge or pride. It was about clarity. If the HOA want to play the paperwork game, I'd bring them every page, every notarized line, every deed with my name etched in ink they couldn't erase. I didn't need to shout or argue. I just needed to open the filing cabinet that had been quietly growing heavier with every property I'd acquired over the years. I started that evening, sat down at the long oak table in my office, turned on the overhead light, and opened the first drawer. Each folder was neatly labeled, sorted by street name, then house number. A habit I developed back when I bought my second property here and realized it wouldn't be my last. I never advertised it. I didn't need to. My tenants were good people, single parents, young couples starting out, retirees on fixed incomes. People who wanted stability, not drama. I gave them fair leases and quiet support. They paid on time, took care of the homes, and lived in peace. Most didn't even know I lived a few doors away. I preferred it that way. One by one, I laid the files out on the table. House after house, name after name, all pointing back to me. 13 properties on this street alone. 2 more on the corner block, and another I was currently renovating. All legally purchased, all up to code, all documented. Some I had bought from families moving out. Some from banks offloading foreclosures. A few were inherited, passed down from relatives who knew the value of land even when the world didn't. I double-checked everything: property tax receipts, county assessments, lease agreements, escrow documents. Nothing was out of place. Nothing could be challenged. It was a paper fortress built over years, quiet and unnoticed. And now, it was my answer to the storm the HOA thought they had summoned. When I was done, I scanned every document into a clean, organized PDF. I didn't want to show up with boxes. I wanted something they couldn't dismiss. Something I could email to their smug little inboxes the moment the time was right. Something they'd be forced to open, to read, to understand. I printed a few copies, too. Slipped them into black folders with silver clasps. Presentation matters. If they wanted official, I'd give them official. If they wanted paperwork, I'd bury them in it. The kind of evidence that doesn't leave room for interpretation. I wasn't bluffing. I wasn't making threats. I was just showing them the truth they never thought to ask about. As I worked, I remembered moments. Faces. The young man at 108 who asked for a short lease because his wife was sick and he wasn't sure how long they'd stay. The old couple on 114 who had no family left but always paid 3 days early with a thank you note clipped to the check. The woman in 123 with 2 jobs and a daughter who walked her dog at sunrise every morning. All of them living under roofs. I kept standing. And none of them had any idea their landlord was being targeted by the very organization that claimed to protect community standards. I wondered what the HOA would say when they found out. Would they backpedal? Would they deny knowing? Would they double down and pretend it didn't matter? I didn't care. My goal wasn't to destroy them. It was to correct them, to wake them up, to remind them that power isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly at the end of the block, surrounded by parked cars and assumptions. By midnight, everything was prepared. The documents were clean, the files were sorted, and the folders were stacked in a leather briefcase I hadn't touched since my last court appearance 5 years ago. Not because I needed it, but because it sent a message. If the HOA wanted to treat this like a legal battle, I was ready. I walked out onto the porch, briefcase in hand, and looked down the street. Every house looked calm. Silent windows, trimmed lawns, porch lights flickering like watchful eyes. I knew those homes better than anyone. I knew their pipes, their beams, the creak in the stairs, and the warmth of the water heaters. I didn't just own the buildings. I maintained them, protected them, improved them. I had never raised rent unfairly, never evicted without reason, never once treated ownership like dominion. That was the difference between me and them. They enforced rules to feel powerful. I built something so solid that no rule could tear it down. The HOA meeting was held in the usual place. A rented room at the local community center, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, plastic chairs arranged in neat little rows facing a long folding table where the board members sat like royalty behind nameplates and bottled water. I arrived early, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see them settle in, watch them get comfortable before the floor shifted beneath them. I wore a simple black button-up and dark jeans. No suit, no tie, just calm confidence. The briefcase rested at my side, heavy with the weight of their oversight. People trickled in, some board members, some residents, a few who were clearly there just for the show. I caught glimpses of sideways glances, whispered guesses. They knew something was coming. The energy in the room was different, tense, like the pause before thunder. Dennis Harwood arrived last, like always, phone in hand, sunglasses pushed up on his head, even though it was evening. He didn't look at me. Didn't need to. In his mind, the outcome was already written. The meeting started with the usual pleasantries. Reading last month's minutes. Updates on landscaping contracts. Someone complained about garbage pickup schedules. And then Dennis cleared his throat and brought the conversation to a matter of ongoing non-compliance regarding excess vehicle storage at one of the properties on Maple Drive. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room turned to look at me at once. He started listing the violations again. Number of vehicles, supposed lawn damage, safety concerns, community image. He spoke like a lawyer, trying to convince a jury of something obvious. His words were polished, practiced. I waited until he finished, until the room settled, and then I stood up, calmly, and reached for the briefcase. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply began passing out the folders. One for Dennis, one for each board member, a few extra for residents who had gathered in the back, curious and wide-eyed. Some flipped them open immediately. Others hesitated, confused. It only took a few seconds before the shift began. Eyes scanning pages, faces tightening with realization. I explained, politely, clearly, that the vehicles in question were all registered to occupants of homes I owned, that I held legal title to 13 properties within the HOA jurisdiction, that each address they had ever discussed behind closed doors was legally tied to me. I pointed out the leases, lawful, current, compliant with all rental codes. I show the tax records, the maintenance receipts, the occupancy permits, all in my name. A few gasps filled the air. Dennis's smirk faltered. The treasurer blinked in surprise. The secretary started flipping through the documents faster, trying to find a loophole that didn't exist. They had tried to find a man who legally owned a third of the neighborhood and hadn't bothered to verify a single detail before building their case. I went further. I pointed out the fact that no formal investigation had been made before the first fine, that no one from the board had spoken to me directly, that towing threats had been issued without due process. I even highlighted a section of their own bylaws stating that homeowner disputes required a warning, a hearing, and an attempt at resolution before punitive action, none of which had been granted to me. There were murmurs now, people exchanging glances. One of the residents in the back stood up and asked if what I was saying was true. I nodded and offered to let anyone view the original documents. Someone else asked how long I had owned the homes. I told them, over 10 years. I'd been here long before Dennis ever joined the board, long before most of the board even bought their own homes. Dennis tried to regain control, stumbling over his words, saying the number of properties didn't change the rules. I agreed. I told him I never asked for special treatment, but I did expect fairness, and transparency, and respect. 3 things the board had failed to offer from the very start. The room was different now. The silence that followed wasn't the hush of control. It was the pause of realization, the crack in the armor, the beginning of a shift they hadn't prepared for. Because the board wasn't just facing a homeowner anymore. They were facing a man who owned the walls around them. After the meeting, everything felt different, even though no one said it out loud. The board members avoided eye contact as they gathered their papers, folding up their little nameplates and water bottles like children packing up after being caught doing something they shouldn't. Dennis didn't look up from his phone once. He mumbled something about reviewing the documents and reconvening later, but everyone knew the damage was done. The illusion of control had cracked. The story they told themselves, that they were managing a neighborhood full of compliant homeowners, was no longer airtight. Not when the guy they tried to find owned more property than all of them combined. The next few days were quiet, but not in the same way as before. This wasn't the silence of tension. It was the silence of recalibration. Like the whole street was trying to figure out what just happened and what it meant for them. I watched them from my front porch, sipping coffee as residents passed by with subtle nods, more respectful now, more careful. Some even waved again, as if to say they understood. I didn't wave back right away. I just let the moment sit. Let them sit with it. What surprised me most were the visitors. First, it was a soft knock on my door from one of the newer board members, a woman named Rachel, who had always seemed uncomfortable with the way Dennis ran things. She stood there holding one of the black folders I had handed out at the meeting, her expression somewhere between apology and curiosity. She asked if we could talk. I let her in, and we sat at the kitchen table while she flipped through the documents again. She admitted she hadn't known. None of them had. Dennis had framed it all as a minor infraction, a small enforcement matter. He hadn't mentioned my name, hadn't disclosed how many properties were involved. He had fed them a version of the truth, so thin it cracked under the weight of facts. Rachel said the board had started talking quietly, cautiously, about restructuring, about term limits, about revisiting how they enforce rules. I listened without committing to anything. I wasn't there to fix their problems, but I was willing to remind them that their power only worked as long as it was rooted in fairness. The moment it became personal, the moment it ignored context, it stopped being governance and became harassment. Not long after that, I started getting emails. Tenants asking if everything was okay. Some had heard whispers. Others had seen the meeting notes posted online. One tenant, a single mother in her 30s, said her neighbor had started treating her differently, like she was connected to something bigger, something people didn't understand. I told her not to worry. Nothing was changing for them. Their homes were still theirs. I had no intention of turning this into a spectacle. But if the board came for them the way it came for me, the response would be louder, sharper, and far more public. A week later, a new letter arrived. This time, it wasn't taped to my door. It came in an envelope, properly addressed, sealed, and respectful. No bold red letters. No finis. Just a clarification of vehicle regulations and a notice that the HOA would be reviewing enforcement procedures for greater fairness and transparency. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest they were ever going to get. And I didn't need an apology. I already had the only acknowledgement that mattered. Silence. Hesitation. A shifting tone. The kind of respect that doesn't come from liking someone, but from realizing you misjudged them. Dennis eventually stepped down. Not immediately, not dramatically, just quietly removed from the board's public listings and replaced with someone new, someone whose name didn't carry the same sour weight. There was no announcement, no explanation, just a quiet disappearance. People said he took a job out of state. Others said he got tired of the politics. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. The board meetings after that felt different. Lighter, less combative. I still attended sometimes, mostly just to sit in the back and listen. They noticed, of course. They always noticed now. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. The balance had shifted, and everyone knew it. No more secret votes. No more sudden fines. When rules were discussed, they were discussed with caution, with clarity, and with copies of the bylaws in hand. My presence was a reminder, not of who I was, but of what they had overlooked. The car stayed in my driveway. The Lincoln gleamed a little brighter each week as the restoration moved forward. My niece's sedan stayed right where it had always been, tucked in beside the black work truck. And the neighbors, the ones who had once whispered, began stopping to chat again. Brief words, careful smiles, small talk about weather and garbage pickup and lawn care. They talked to me like I belonged now, but the truth was I had always belonged. It was the rest of them who were just now catching up to the reality I had quietly built house by house, deed by deed, until the entire street was mine in all but name.